Good evening, history friends, and welcome to this live review of Teaching the Early Modern Period, or I should say, Teaching and Learning the Early Modern Period. It's always an act of faith talking into this thing, so people could give me like a little thumbs up in the chat. I'll also kind of teach you how to use that, because we have a couple people who are, I think, having their first Fiveable experience tonight. So in the chat there, you can just make a little comment that you can hear me. Right. We also have Fiveable original Dylan Black in the house. Possible future history educator. Is that still a possibility? I know you're working for the chemistry too, Dylan. So welcome. There's a poll in the kind of in between where my face is and the over on the chat there. So if you look in the poll, you can see one of the things with this period. I'm going to toggle the screen a little bit. I just learned how to do this. The kids, they teach me all kinds of things. I saw Charlie do this. That is, there's different ways that we can name it. And, to some degree that matters. Maybe to some degree it doesn't. But I think it is still kind of interesting, especially with everything. For people who are teaching AP World right now, everything kind of existing in our folders and files with multiple names. It's just, it's almost like a death by 1,000 cuts, like all these little changing stuff from period whatever to whatever. So you can click on that right there. You'll also notice down in the same area where the poll is, there's a ask a question. And so if you have a question, you can type it right in the chat. That's going to be a smaller group tonight. There's a lot more students that are teachers. And so like in the world, and our streams are mostly aimed at students. So we'll have a nice group for talking. You can always ask a question in the chat because I can see that. But it's also, you can park a question in the ask a question spot. And I know a few of you are teachers. And so one of the reasons why I'm happy you're here is so you can see how this would work if your students were checking in. Of course, the content would be a fair bit different. I am interested in kind of having a discussion with people who already know a lot of the underlying history about what's the best way to frame it. But today, this afternoon, there was a great student, a 10th grader, Charlie Castillo from New Jersey, and she was talking about how she approaches the DBQ. And so the other students who were there were in 9th and 10th grade themselves, and I think it was really useful to hear from somebody else who had been in their position. And she just went through was the 2017 DBQ, I think, or I modified it a little bit. But she went through that and was like, here's what I would do with this document. Here's what I would do with this document. So those kinds of streams are happening. I'm going to show you too with the Fiveable here, available on these different social media platforms. I'm a big tweeter myself, so I think I know Mr. Lutz through the Twitters. So that's a way to stay in touch with me. But the Instagram page for Fiveable, I understand, has a lot of the memes on it, like the kids like. So that's worth checking out. And then some of the classic videos are on the YouTube channel. So again, those would be good resources for students. I think the Twitter, like it kind of happens, is a good way to keep in touch as grown-ups. Or both, right? So here are some upcoming events that we have. And you can see that there is a mix of things in terms of, and I'll tell you who the people are. So tomorrow night, Carolyn Castellanos, who is an AP World teacher in San Antonio, Texas, is going to be doing a review of diasporic communities. And I sort of put this in the subtitle, but it's a little bit like, for the students, if you don't know what this is, you might want to watch because it's one of those words that comes up a lot. Thanks. Oh, hi, Sunny. I saw Sunny's question here. So I'm going to be talking about how I frame this. So it might not be as useful for you because I know you're a student and I've seen you in streams in the same way that Mrs. Thiessen's was yesterday. And so for teachers, there's in the review bank, there's one there. But I will be going over the same time period, and I'll be talking about how I see some of these same events, and that might be useful. That might be useful for you. You can feel free to watch a little bit and see. So do that. And you can always see how Sunny parked that question there. She is a veteran. and has done this before. So that stream, and then the stream next week, coming from California with James Zucker, who's also a teacher. He teaches in Los Angeles, and he's going to be talking about gender as a theme, which often we can kind of lose that, I feel like, in the AP World class. Then we also have student-to-student study streams. I mentioned Charlie's this afternoon, where Charlie was talking about doing the DBQ. And though on Sundays, every Sunday, kind of alternating times between East Coast friendly and West Coast friendly. So coming from California, Jamal and Jed are both great students who will offer quality advice. And that's really mostly Q&A. So students could tune into that and just ask them questions. And they're both very thoughtful young people. Doing this is really, it's the kind of thing, you know how it is for people who are teachers. It can restore your faith in the future. So we feel good about that. And then the kind of stream that I'm doing here tonight, which is more aimed at teachers, I'm going to do those once a month on the second Wednesday. So the next one I'm going to do is going to be on how do we decolonize, the way we talk about the age of revolutions, which is something that I've written about more than this and put more things out there. So there we are. Anyone have any questions about those things as we roll forward? All right, well, let's take a look at this here, and I will make my head smaller, but I don't know everybody in the group, so I just wanted to say hello. So here's who I am. I don't know if you need biographical information and my big face there. But so I'm the lead AP World teacher here at Fiveable, and the main thing that means is I coordinate our streams. So I kind of, with suggestion, come up with the topics, and I also review people's slides. So any slide that comes across a Fiveable stream, I've seen. So good or ill, that's true. I'm also have taught for a long time and been an AP reader for both Euro and World. Those are my professional goals with the course. One of the reasons why I was interested in doing this was a way to, oh, hi, Camlin. That is nice to see you. Was because I think it's very important that we continue to decolonize the class. Like AP World History was originally an intervention in the history curriculum to make it more equitable and inclusive. And I'm committed to that. I've learned so much teaching this class. So those are ways to get a hold of me. A lot of the ideas that I say I've written about before to clarify my thoughts. So let's take a peek. I'm going to start out here with a source then that I had in the image in the blog post. So as you take a look at this, people can type into the chat, what kinds of things do you notice about this early map? Like what's there, what's not, what's it show? Yeah, and where do you see the green? What coast do the Portuguese seem to know about? The idea here is, this is how the Portuguese saw the world. And what I worry about with this time period sometimes is that this is kind of the picture of the world that still is presented in a lot of world history classes in terms of how things are connected to each other. So we're going to take a look at a few different things here. I'm going to actually pop over the top of a slide. I didn't mean to go like that. So how can we make our classes different from what that picture looked like? With the hollow China and the hollow China and the just parts of the African coast and things. How can we take our class and do better than the Portuguese in 1502 with how we present things to the world? So here's a question that we could discuss. So you take a look at this quotation, and this is from a book that I wrote about in the blog post that went with this. And I'm going to read it, and the reason why is some people are probably watching on phones and it might be difficult to read. So I know having people read slides to you isn't like cutting edge pedagogy, but we'll go ahead and do that here. So this is from Robert Marx, The Origins of the Modern World, which a lot of people who I think very highly of recommended to me. And he starts the second chapter to the 4th edition, which just came out this summer, of this world history book. It says, most historians agree with Adam Smith that the voyages of Christopher Columbus across the Atlantic in 1492 and Vasco da Gama around Africa's Cape of Good Hope in the Indian Ocean in 1498 constitute key moments in the emergence of the modern world. Indeed, they were. Where historians disagree is how important were they? Did they represent a new era? Did they really change all that much? And so I am curious what people think about this. And it isn't meant to be like super provocative. Like, I mean, obviously they are important to some degree. So how do we think about like what is significant about Columbus and da Gama? Okay, people. Wait time is a little tricky in this situation because of the lag where things are. So I'm doing better with that. But if people could type in like, what do you think? How might you respond to the presentation, the idea here? So just the question at the end of the sentence there, like how would you address that as a historian? Did they represent a new era? So Columbus and da Gama. Thinking about that is the keynote here, right? Which is now part of Unit 4, even though I think a lot of people might cover that first, those expanding interactions. I clearly think that these are important figures, and you know what Mr. Lutz has there in the chat is clearly, oh, you know, these are sort of watershed events. But it's the kind of thing that we should think critically about as we're looking at how we present like the overall narrative of the class. So in some ways, this stream is really going to be about decolonizing how we talk about this. How can we talk about this in a way that's more inclusive, but is also accurate? Okay. So here's a tweet from Lincoln Payne, who is one of the foremost maritime historians, and he's occasional participator in the WHAP chat, or he'll loop in, and he was responding here to a question that we were doing last spring about when does globalization begin, and he said you have to go all the way to 1565, in his opinion, like as a maritime historian, because that's when the first west to east crossing of the Pacific happened. That, you know, like documented crossing of the Pacific with somebody who then was able to return. So trans-Pacific journey. So this Urdaneta pioneered this route that eventually, you might recognize this from maps in our world history books, right? What's this? You see those trade winds there? What's this going to turn into? You know, going forward, right? This is going to be the Manila Galleon route. And so when that happens, then he said, well, now we really have a global world. So when we look at those global trade routes, I'm trying to work on my own presentation of this. So we're bringing all the different things in with this. So this is another way that this is global, right? Like Mike was saying, is expanding interactions across the oceans, right? Are ushered in that. We see da Gama's route to India and Columbus's route across the Atlantic. This map from the Invaluable Slave Voyages website. People been to slavevoyages.org. This is the work of, you know, just I think literally thousands of people putting data in there. It's, you know, it's invaluable. It's amazing. And it changes, right? You go back and the numbers will be slightly different because people are looking at new shifts manifest and everything. Oh, when you've showed it to class, yes, right. You mean the animation like with all the dots and then it just like the dots, there's more and more dots. There's a dot animation one. Or though there's also now, yeah, that's something when you look at that. And it's also a good way to show students the distribution of people. My students have American history first, and we don't have a lot of world history here in Minnesota, unfortunately. And so it's really kind of important to pull them out of this, U.S. centered framework for how they're looking at things. Okay. So the Columbian exchange is also part of this process. And I think it's important to keep that global. One of the things I've learned teaching the class is, the role of new crops in Africa and East Asia. Very interesting that way. Okay. So as we think about like these sort of images that we have, which areas are being marginalized that are outside of their importance? So these are all sort of common: Manila Galleon, world trade, transatlantic slave trade. Okay, those things are important, so it's not like those things should go away. But what things, if we only do that, what really important places, developments, stories are we leaving out? And that's always kind of one of the questions when doing this sort of work. Think about that. And the wait time with this it's an interesting deal. So feel free to drop questions in there anytime in the chat. I'm prone to the overstatement, so you should feel free to call that out. So what I want to look at then is how much of what's left kind of out of that or overemphasized there as a result of like legacy practices. What I mean by legacy practices is the legacy of past courses, the courses we had as students. Like, I'm old, I took Western civilization in high school. I didn't have a world history class until I was 19 years into. I was in college. It was a pretty good class. World Since 1500 with J.R. Christensen, 1986. That was a good class, but these practices, and some schools have been teaching world history basically as Western Civ, or Western Civ as world history for a long time. And so my comments here are kind of based on 3 decades of sitting in curriculum meetings, hanging out on Facebook pages, talking to people on Twitter, hearing about people's experiences with their state standards. So people's experiences will differ, and I'd be very interested in ways that, like, the story, the way I see it, is not the same as the way other people see it. Okay. So one of the problems in this age is we get into the period now where European action is important. So that's true. And so we should talk about that. But what winds up happening is, because the narrative that we've inherited from our previous classes, that's embedded in the state standards, that is expected by people in our community, perhaps, depending on our communities, is one where Europeans are actors and other people are reacting. So what we don't want to do is take the perspective narrate things from the perspective of one set of historical actors, even if we're trying to be balanced when we go through there. So this image is from 1624. It's like the first draft of history, the history of the Virginia colony. And here's like John Smith, and he's acting, and the chief here of the Pamunkey is just waiting to react. And so that's kind of the way, that's what I want to think about differently myself, and what I want to encourage people to consider. So take a look at that. So. Okay. In some of my writings, I use this a lot, this idea of the European tunnel of time. And it's a phrase that came from a quotation that's in the introduction to the field guide to the New World History, the Ross Dunn, Laura Mitchell, Carrie Ward book, which is great. A lot of great short essays in there. I think I think I know Mike has used the Craig Lockhart one in there. There's a lot of good essays in that, and it talks about how the way that European history became part of Western Civ and world history is it created this really tight narrative where events were linked together in like this unbreakable chain of cause and effect. So it's like you're in a tunnel, and then everything kind of just goes through that tunnel. And some of the things in the tunnel are important, and anything could be the object of useful historical study. You know, we could analyze perspective and sourcing and do those things. But here's what happens. What happens is, and again, this is based on a lot of conversations with people talking about curriculum, is I've never been in a conversation where I've heard another teacher say, how can we talk about modern China if we haven't discussed Neo-Confucianism in detail with the kids? I've never heard anybody say that. But I've heard multiple people tell me that if we don't work our way through the intricacies of the Italian Renaissance, the kids will be incapable of understanding democratic protest in Egypt in 2011. And so what happens is, because we have greater detailed knowledge, the granularity, the grain size, of our knowledge of European history, or what we've inherited, is smaller, more detailed. There's this pull back to these other events. So it's Robert Marks, and then Bram Hubbell has reminded me sagely several times. Bram's a teacher, legendary world history teacher. Eurocentrism isn't just about how much do we talk about different parts of the world. Eurocentrism is about how much attention and detail do we give to different places, and how do we frame things? So. Okay. Right. So this greater detail isn't the same as doing case studies in Europe. Like anything that I talk about where I feel like Europe gets too much detail could be an interesting case study in world history. Like the Renaissance is fascinating. I taught AP Euro. There's a lot of great source material. It's much more global than how it usually gets talked about. I was like, Pico della Mirandola, like he's reading all these people from around the Mediterranean, and you can really do a lot of interesting things. But if every single thing that gets treated at the level of detail of a case study is from one part of the world, and each of those events is viewed as indispensable, that's where we run into trouble. So it's having the courage to break free from those things. All right. So, for example, I think the Reformation is a really good example of that. Again, this is a statue from the church basement where I attend and teach confirmation. I went to Luther College. Like I lived in Ilvesaker Hall. So, I have some Norwegian Reformation street credibility. And I think it's really interesting to talk about. I don't think it's essential to talking about this time period on a global scale beyond kind of summarizing for students, what happens with it. And so this is part of the influence of this curriculum, this legacy curriculum that we have. So do we go into the same number of details as we go into here, like with the Sunni and Shiite split? I think most people don't. I think we kind of gloss that, generally speaking, as like, here's the main idea of the split about political leadership in the community. Different traditions resulted, and then later, other entities like the Ottomans or the Safavids adopt this difference, and then they use it to mobilize people for their imperial projects. I think you can summarize the Sunni Shiite split in that way. And so here's the thing. You could do the same thing with the Reformation. Now, you could dive into either one, but what I want to question is the idea that any one of these events is essential to understanding something else in that detail. And I think this is an area where big history has provided some really important insights, because what big history is good at is the Big History Project is at really summarizing things, saying there's only 3 eras in human history, right? Foraging, agriculture, and industry. Wow. Okay, that's something to think about. And so a lot of what we think of or gets presented as essential elements of causality really come down to creating context. So people will say, well, we have to understand the details of the German Reformation in order to understand the missionary zeal of exploration. I guess I don't know, especially since exploration starts like the Portuguese in West Africa. It's like 100 years before the Reformation, so it clearly can't be the key causal event. On the other hand, things like the Jesuits in around the world, okay, so it provides context. So the two suggestions I have here, the two interventions that I'm imagining, for people, is that we really question if things are we really have to question if things are essential causations or if they really just provide more context. No, and when I'm talking, I was seeing Mr. Lutz's comment here. I'm really responding to myself too, because, and here's why this is hard, I think. It is our job to make things more intelligible to other students, or to other people, to students. So we want to kind of explain and tell them a story that helps them remember it. And I think we can do that without, while keeping the grain size of the different areas, similar. So here's a way that in this time period, I think we look at places in different ways. So on the one hand, we have these Western European trade restrictions, and they get given this fancy name that, thousands and thousands of poor high school students have been forced to memorize, which I've done that. Mercantilism or mercantilism. Do people say mercantilism or mercantilism? I started out saying it one way, and I've noticed myself saying it a different way now, and I'm not sure why. But if we have that, so this gets this fancy name, but then the other things that are happening that I think we could draw parallels in East Asia, those are glossed then as isolationism. So my idea would be to do that. Oh, great. Yeah, with I saw Kelly's question. I will come back to that. I'm just taking a look here. I don't think it's so much. Actually, I have an idea right now, so I'm going to answer that. So looking at that map of the slave trade, I think with all those maps in that first section, I don't think there's anything wrong with any of those. It's just that they're incomplete. And with Africa and the map of Portugal, I think that map's great with the transatlantic slave trade, and I've used it. I'll continue to use it. I think it's important that if we're going to talk about Africa in this time period, and I think I know from some of our other interactions online that you would agree that we need to also be talking about other things that are happening in Africa. One of the things so that's what's missing is, like, in none of those maps did we see like other parts of Africa. That's how I would see that. So that's not a do something instead. It's like that, or if we're going to talk about Africa, let's be sure we're talking about, other parts of Africa in all its messiness. All right. Now I have to go back to my other screen. So if we were to look at the thank you for coming. It's really great interacting in this way too. If we were to take a closer look at these East Asian societies, and we would see some other things. So I have a link to a blog post that Bram Hubble did on his Liberating Narratives blog. And that post talks about, kind of how Japan is not as isolated as it seems. And certainly, again, if you're going to give them just the main idea, Japan does try to restrict trade. But why is that seen as this almost self-defeating act when, if you look at it in more detail, there's still a lot of information and goods coming in and out of Japan. And so, again, I think that's looking at things from the perspective of Europeans who wanted to trade there with the Japanese, and the Japanese wanted to control that trade. I mean, perhaps because they saw what had happened in Malacca and Java, and or heard about what happened in Mombasa and the Americas. I mean, they had their reasons for wanting to limit that. And then as a result, though, when we look at this, it's just the presentation of it in textbooks. And in Bram's post, he said something that I've noticed too. It's like, if I haven't covered that in class, what students get from our textbook, which is the Bentley Traditions and Encounters book, or like at the AP reading, you see what kids are writing. It's like, and they're kids, right? So it's pretty absolutist language coming from the 15-year-olds that, it's like, well, then all of a sudden they completely cut trade off. And that's just kind of quite simply not true. And at the same time, these other kinds of acts are kind of treated in a different way. All right. So what does this look like then in the new AP curriculum? The new AP World History Modern? Well, I think there are opportunities that the new curriculum presents because there's more time. There's time that we could be using to do some, other kinds of things in here. So there's a lot of stuff happening in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, and we can use that time to go into more depth. And it does emphasize those global themes. There's nothing, again, wrong. I mean, Columbus to Gama, that stuff is really important, and it does connect some things. Okay. I think that curriculum leaves serious gaps. And to me, it really seems like it's an issue of a kind of political correctness in the way they present things, in that they're afraid to talk about some of these topics. And I think there's also, I also see this as almost like a theoretical issue with how the new curriculum really emphasizes causation, which is kind of part of what I'm getting at here, that there's this train of events and we can identify causes to them, but then effects of those same events just kind of hang out there. So especially with these first two things, or the second two things, capitalism and race, those just kind of disappear, almost literally, from the new course and exam description. And I think some of that's political sensitivity to wanting to expand the course into areas where, school districts where those topics might not be popular with elected school boards. But I also think it's part of an emphasis on always trying to talk about what caused events, as opposed to looking at the structures that are created by them, or they're the structures that emerge in the wake of them. Okay. And then I think there are some barriers that we'll need to remove in order to do this well. I think a lot of people I've noticed in the Facebook group and on Twitter and just conversations with other teachers, that the problem that a lot of us bumped into with the new units 1 and 2, where they kind of didn't seem separate, and some of the things in unit 2 seem like they should come before the things in unit 1, and the same thing happens in unit 3 and 4, where I think some people will start with the exploration, discovery, voyaging stuff, and then go, back to the land empires. So I think there's that issue. And then also the way these new developments are siloed away from any kind of, structural analysis of what's happening. And so these will be things that I think teachers will need to put back in. Now, I'm not going to go, well, I'll show you one more slide, then I'll tell you. Some of you might have seen, I went and I tried to decolonize. This is me cutting up the course and exam description with my 8-year-old this summer. And what I was doing is I tried to put things into the old key concepts. And what it showed, I still haven't decided if this was an emotionally healthy way to deal with things or not. So I'll let you decide that, if this was emotionally healthy or not. But I wanted to see what it did for me as a teacher educationally, is it let me see which things kind of disappear. So the word race is in the smallest possible font. The bigger font that anything's in, then the more important, the place of prominence it has. And so that middle column there, you can see the structural, that's like capitalism, race, the new structures of the new world system. That stuff just disappears. So it's all just the two other columns. Now, that said, any kind of curriculum is going to have pros and cons. I'm not here to like rehash all that. But I think, kind of going back to this slide, it's pretty simple. We have more time. So my proposition is we should fill the gaps and remove the barriers. All right. I'll pause for a second because I've really been talking. People have any questions or comments, thoughts? Got 2 votes for early modern. Nice. Feel free to vote in the poll if you came a little later. Cool. You can check that out. Well, good group here. All right. You might also, if you haven't noticed, underneath my screen, there's a call to action button. If you click that, it'll take you to the other streams that you could look at either for your students or yourself. Live reviews to save your spot for. And also there's a link to resources, and a lot of the different things I'm talking about I linked down there so you can find them. Okay. So what do we do with this then? And I use the word decolonizing. I know it's kind of problematic. It's problematic in the sense that for indigenous people in the United States, or maybe indigenous people in other places, decolonizing like has a literal meaning that we should not take lightly. In world history, where colonization most often refers to expansion of European empires, I think it still, for me at least, is a useful term where we can talk about how can we remove that Western Eurocentric narrative from just keep it from distorting other things, even while we continue to talk about the important developments that are related to that history. So that's sort of what I mean by decolonization. All right, let's take a look. We've got a question here. Yep, I'm having a little technical kind of an issue. If someone had a question, if you wouldn't mind typing it into the chat, that'd be helpful because I'm having a little bit of a problem opening this other thing up here. In case, unless it's somebody who has come and gone. I'm having a little bit of trouble. Maybe that's happened. And can people still hear me? Okay, cool. I don't know what kind of happened there. I think it was hardware on my end, or user error is always like a huge possibility here, right? All right, I can see the questions now. So yeah, so Liz is asking, how do teachers, and I would like people to chime in too. So I'll read the question here. So it's in the timestamp thing. How do teachers incorporate absent narratives of new immigrant populations during this time period when that information is not always readily available? I mean, like, are you talking about like populations of students who we have here in like our classes who maybe don't see themselves as represented in world history? I think that is a challenge, and it can be tough to find some of those things. Yeah, to bring that in. So if we're talking about how we have this big narrative that we're trying to minimize, but then maybe we're going to be bringing in other big civilizations. I guess I'll just start with saying, I'm open to suggestion. And if there's things that people have, we should share them. Yeah, great. Yeah. And I know, I think I understand what you're saying. I have found in Minnesota, we have a lot of Southeast Asian students, and in our classes. I have a few, and I know other teachers in Minnesota have a lot more. And I think I found it means a lot to those students to incorporate some more of that perspective, even if it's not exactly their experience. So, I have a few Hmong students in class. And for people who aren't familiar, Hmong people are an ethnic minority group from what's today Laos, but also had lived at different times in China and other places. So I think there's a few different things there. I think talking in the opening part of the class about shamanism was useful because a number of these students identify as shamanistic, or their families do, just as a way of covering like that other region of the world, and kind of bringing that in, so they're at least seeing people who look a little more like them. And then the same thing, like thinking about East African students, again, thinking about the oh, that looks great, thank you, Mike. Check that out, and that might be really useful, Liz, for your students. Just trying to bring those kinds of things in, whenever we can. But it is difficult because we don't have the same written sources. And so I think it's important to just own that and tell kids that here's stories we're not getting, and then how can we get at them. So just today in my on-level class, I did the Swahili activity that's on my blog that I've been working on for a few years. And it's like, well, we don't have things written by people in East Africa from this time, but we do have the language that they use. And the language that they use, Swahili, has words from other languages, but it's mostly not. So why did they incorporate some words, and why did they not incorporate others? And so then it's a way to use that language as a way to break things down. And then I pair that with text with Ibn Battuta. And so then I selected a little bit of when he's remembering being in Mogadishu, because we do have, I have a few Somali students in class. Again, some teachers in Minnesota would have many more Somali students in class, or Oromo students who are culturally a little similar to Somali, but of course it's different. So finding those things. So I kind of think the first step is owning it and letting kids know, here's why some of these things are missing, but then finding some of those other ways to bring it in. I know I showed my class when we were doing the Yuan dynasty, the painting of Kublai Khan as a Chinese emperor, and he's wearing white. And then when I was finding the picture, I hadn't known this, but he was wearing white because he's trying to simultaneously present himself as a Mongol shaman and as a Chinese emperor. So it's kind of like a little trick, right? So you look at the last two Song emperors, their official portraits, they're in red. And so he's wearing white. So I tell the class this is a small detail. And this student comes up to me after class and says, well, my family's shamanistic. So are we connected to the Mongols then? And I'm like, well, probably not. But it does show you how there's this broader universal experience that happens. So I think really covering some of those just trying to globalize the coverage. I did write a few things down about what I plan to do just with Southeast Asia, bringing that up sooner. And in like island Southeast Asia, there's inscriptions. They're not the same thing as narratives. I mean, because part of the problem there is that the written sources are on palm leaves and the stuff is rotted. I mean, literally, like Javanese people were writing, we just don't have it. But they were carving things into stone. And so you can see some of that. So even just showing like Angkor Wat and Borobudur and some of those like monumental architecture, like, look what people did. I think that can be helpful too. But I'm going to follow that link when I'm done here too. So thank you for that, Mike. Okay. So let's take a look here. So I think part of the reason why I was saying all those things about like causality before is I think part of the issue is for people teaching world history, our sense of professional authority for a long time has come from what we know. And what we know then is sort of based on being able to create this understandable narrative from all this data for students. And I think that this is one of the reasons that some students, at least, don't trust history. They're not as into it as we are, which seems sad and wrong, but they're not. And I think it's because I had a student once, one of my favorite student comments ever, from a student who was, somewhat at risk of not succeeding academically. He's a really nice kid. But he said, history is sketchy, Mr. Beckman. It's sketchy. I'm like, well, you're right, man. We don't totally know what happened. So I think this might also be more of an answer to Liz's question as we go through here. And that is like, what are some ways then that we can broaden out? And I think it's important to start with this idea that Marx talks about, that everything's contingent, that things happen because of conjunctures and there's accidents. So if you think of like Columbus, like that's an accident. He thinks he landed, he's in China. He thinks he's in China and he's really in Cuba, right? So it's this clear accident thing, but the conjuncture of all these other things, the disease and the Spanish crown and the, growing authority of kings, the ability to finance voyages. It's this conjuncture of all these things is what leads to it. So that we're not telling students, it's like this one thing happened. And if that hadn't happened, then everything would have been different. Maybe things would have been different, but doing that. So let's take a look at some ways that can work. I'm a little abstract. I'm going to be more concrete for the last bit. So one way that I've reframed what I have done is by panning out. You can see more things, and that's going to be putting the age of discovery, exploration. Really what we're talking about is sailing. And in the Liberating Narratives blog on East Asian isolation that I linked to in the resources there, one of the things that Bram talks about is how, he cites a few historians, but that the Ming, they didn't decide to become isolationists because they were silly. It's like they were running out of wood and they'd accomplished their objectives. Like they had done reconnaissance in the Indian Ocean. They did it. Like, it's like meeting's over. Like we've accomplished this. So we want to think more broadly that there's all this voyaging happening at this time. And then it's the conjuncture of certain voyagers representing certain states running into certain pieces of land that is what causes these big results. So again, it's not taking anything away from, say, like Columbus's sailing, which I think still is like pretty interesting, but it's to say, and it's also not to demonize Columbus either. I mean, we should recognize both. It's just to say that this is a result of this kind of conjuncture, and other people were doing this interesting sailing. And the College Board can take Polynesian wayfinding out of the curriculum, but they can't stop me from showing this picture. So we're gonna do that. And actually, it's the Voyages textbook, which I know that Liz has used. The thing on wayfinding in there is great. I actually made a copy of that and I handed it out to my kids. Okay. So it's also important to talk about, the technology. And I think a lot of people in AP world do this. When you take a look at the ship, it's like, the compass and the rudder and the lateen sail, which had, that these things are all Afro-Eurasian. So I think it's also important to do that. I think so that's one intervention, is to kind of think more globally about sailing and voyaging, and less about discovery or exploration, and just like, this is voyaging and it has these effects. Again, thinking of effects more than tight networks or tight chains of causation. And I think a second intervention would be to be sure that we're waiting to when we declare European hegemony. And according to Robert Marx in Origins of the Modern World, we should wait until 1800, basically. That it's not until industrial technology happens that these things, that Europeans are hegemonic around the world. That's not to say that things like trading forts, like Fort Jesus here in Mombasa, Kenya, like, it's not to say that wasn't an important thing. It was, but the Portuguese weren't able to hang on to it. They'd had it for about 100 years and then they lost it. And, it's important, but it's not like all of a sudden this is a colony. The whole hinterland was still locally governed. And it's not until the British show up, almost 200 years after the Portuguese have lost this fort to the Almanis. So we have to kind of delay. I always like to tell the McCartney mission story to my students at 1793 and the George McCartney shows up from Britain at the court of the Qing Emperor, and he shows him all these things. The Qing Emperor basically says, "We don't need any of this crap. Like, why are you bringing me these things? We don't want these things." Now, eventually, then it'll be opium, and Marx really leans into that. So I think that's something I want to do more. Like, I, of course, have covered the Opium Wars, but lean into that. But so these are things, it's not until like into the 1800s, the first time the British send a fleet up the Pearl River, where Canton is, the Chinese sink it. Now, over time, British industrialization is going to make a big difference. So it's not that we change the story. It's just the story we've been telling, or maybe at least that some people have been telling, where European imperialism starts. And so now we flip a switch on in 1450 and it's a European dominated world. I mean, that is just simply incorrect. And so kind of paying attention to that. The DBQ last year for the test was great for this because it showed the Portuguese, it showed something a little bit. This map represents the idea that the Portuguese and the Ottomans were competing in the Indian Ocean. So I think that's another way to kind of think about that. There. Okay. Questions or thoughts on that? I think the phrase trading post empires is really useful, and that's a good vocabulary word to drill into kids so that they know, okay, this isn't the same thing as as maybe what happens when Europeans show up in the Americas and there's the Great Dying, and it's not the same thing as like machine guns in the Sudan in 1898. Now, here's another intervention that's been really interesting to me. And this is another way that we can pan out. And this is from a great book that I read. It looks like, did I animate the thing? Yeah. The book is called Selling Empire by a guy named Jonathan Eckett. And I linked in there, there's a podcast episode where he's on Ben Franklin's World with Liz Covart, which you may have heard. It's usually half hour or a little more. It's a good little deal. I've listened to several of those on my commute. And so I heard the one where he was interviewed. So if you don't have time to read the book, you could listen to that podcast because this bow tie trade thing comes up in there. And basically what he's saying in the book, Eckett, he's saying a lot of things. And the main idea that he's making is that you can't separate like Indian and American history out from British history. Like those things are intimately connected in more ways. The Boston Tea Party, I guess that tea would have been from China, but it's the Dutch East India Company, or the British East India Company, excuse me, that's selling the tea. And then the calico, all this stuff about the cloth. So he says, like in the quotation here, that the triangular trade really is a bow tie. And that bow tie means that there's another triangle, if you will, happening in like India and West Africa. And here's why I think this is important and something I want to lean into with my kids. And that is that when we put up those triangular trade maps and talk about the triangular trade, and it talks about manufactured goods coming from Britain to West Africa, that's true. But those manufactured goods were mostly not things that were manufactured in Britain. They're being re-exported from there. The cloth is coming in, and it's mostly cloth. Now, later there will be firearms and, of course, alcohol. So those things are part of it. So we don't, again, want to disavow that because it's not. But at least at first, especially, it's the cotton cloth, which was like the premier trade good in global trade, for centuries. It still is, and we're probably all wearing some cotton that came from somewhere else. So cotton cloth is, and then also silk, to some degree, is the trade good there. So Bram Hubble shared this map here, and I think this is a good one for showing the bow tie trade. But the manufacturing is still largely happening in China and India, up until around 1900, where you get this change. And then London would be the knot in that chain, in that bow tie. So those are a couple of areas where I think we can pan out. We can take the triangular trade and pan out from that and look at then how is the Atlantic economy connected to the Indian Ocean. And you could do the same thing with the Pacific. And you can take Voyaging and pan out in time and see how is that like part of a longer tradition and a bigger tradition. So I think this is a way as world historians to avoid getting sort of burrowed into the one tunnel of events. We have that. Oh yeah, age of revolution, for sure. And that's something I know that a lot of us have been talking about for a while. So where are you gonna pan out from and to, Mike? So if you think of like France, and then you're gonna pan out to pan out Latin America, Haiti, Tupac Amaru, all those things. Yeah, good stuff. All right, so then that's kind of like removing some of those barriers by panning out. Yeah, right. And West, yeah, that is really I started working on that a little bit. I know that other people, we were talking about the West African influence on the Haitian Revolution. That is a really interesting area to take a look at. And then also indigenous people and the revolutions in the Americas. Those are things I want to stress a little more this year. So again, another thing that's good about having some of that extra time to do, we can do like an extra thing. Like I did a reading that I tweeted this out that Jason Fernandez from Memphis shared on Great Zimbabwe. Now, some people may, of course, have covered Great Zimbabwe before, but it's not something I thought I'd had time for. And so I was able to put that in. I think we really benefit from that. Oh, yeah. That is a great essay. And I think that would be good. I think students could read excerpts of that, especially, like I know you're working with 10th graders, but by the time you get to the age of revolutions, you've had them for a while. You've been doing some things. I think they can break that down. Laurent Dubois, who wrote that, is a good writer. Kids will be able to do it. Yeah. And I also really like for Age of Revolutions, Laurent Dubois, who wrote that essay, also wrote the text for a graphic history of the Haitian Revolution on the Nib, which is a cartoon or comic site. It's really good. So this is what, as we're adding more things in, and I've already said this in several different ways, we should avoid. So these are the three things that I think that I hinted before that I think would be useful to add back into this unit, into this time period that are in the new course and exam description. You can find them in there. And we should always remember that any evidence that a student uses in an essay, as long as it's historically accurate and they're using it correctly on the AP test, is going to count as evidence, even if it wasn't one of the listed illustrative examples in the in the course and exam description. So there's all kinds of examples kids could use, and people who've done the reading. Like every year, I did the reading this year, and I read the first short answer question on nomads and non-nomads. I learned several things. I had a tab open to Google things, and I learned stuff about the Hittites that I hadn't learned. Some kids were bringing the Hittite knowledge in May. I don't know if they studied that right before the test because it was one of the first things they did, or if they just had gotten really interested in it. But several kids used Hittites as an example of nomads interacting with non-nomads. I was like, oh, I need to look up and see if this is true because I didn't know. It was like most of the time. They were right. I say all that as a way of saying that any example that a kid is using on an essay is going to, if they use it correctly and it's evidence, is going to help them. It's going to count as evidence. So it's just the only thing that the course and exam description limits is kind of what could be in the stimulus, but as long as for multiple choice, but as long as we're teaching kids the big ideas and how to break down things they don't know, well, they should be fine. So do that. So I think this is true with race. I think this is one of the biggest shortcomings in the new course and exam description is that the word race doesn't really get mentioned until the very end of the book. And then it's like people were against racism. And like, if you just picked up that book and you had didn't know any other history than what was in there, you'd be like, what are people mad about? Because it doesn't go through the the history of how those things were formed. I also think those racial categories and systems of oppression. I also think that it's really important that we let kids know that racial categories are constructed and they change over time and they can handle some of that. It's always a fine line. You don't want, then some students, maybe racially privileged students, will be like, "Whoa, you mean race doesn't exist, so I don't have to worry about it?" No, I mean the opposite. But I think students can understand that race has a history. It's not the same in every time and every place. That is something that we can do with them. The same thing with capitalism, and I posted a link to how I deal with this. It's like capitalism doesn't exist in the new course until Adam Smith has an idea, which is not historic at all. I think you can start with those East India companies. And one of the things that I have done is giving kids a fairly robust definition of capitalism that's more than just free markets, kind of a meatier definition of capitalism, and then had them look and see, like, when does capitalism emerge? And what they'll see is what historians argue about is that, well, it's kind of capitalist when these East India stock exchange things are happening, but it's also kind of not. It's kind of capitalist when they're doing the putting out system and rural industry. It's kind of not. They say they're for free markets, but they're always trying to rig the market. So kids will see how it's ambiguous, and then you can tell them there's no easy answer here, but I want you to kind of see where these features come from. That capitalist world economy in the 1800s is going to be so important, and the kids should know. I mean, I'd honestly say they have a right to know that it didn't just like spring out of somebody's brain. Adam Smith is describing the world as he sees it. He's not like inventing something like that. And then lastly, with the environment, I mean, I don't know. I imagine a lot of people didn't spend a lot of time teaching this, and then it's controversial in some places. But I think we can talk about climate in this period. I know there's some interesting research that's come out about how European colonization changed the climate because of the huge ecosystem effects from the great dying of Native American people and just other ways the landscape changed. But even if not, that little ice age and how it influenced things is something that we can bring up with kids, at least, to kind of give them this bigger, more global idea. All right. That is my last big thought. Thank you for sticking around and listening and participating. Do people? Oh, I just saw the Maroons comment there. I mean, to which I say, right on. And that is something that I think we can talk about in this period and those kind of communities. I think it's important for kids to know that, not every, people were fighting, not everybody submitted. And so, yes, I'd be very interested in what you do with that or what kind of sources you're using, because I think that'd be very useful with that. Any other questions or comments or feedback? Yes, that makes a lot of sense to me too, that we want to help students understand that nation states are new and they don't really exist most places, especially in this time period. And so now here's people organizing themselves in another way. And I also really like how talking about those kind of communities helps students to understand that freedom wasn't invented like in a salon in Paris. But those things are important. But again, I see the Enlightenment as context for how people express this longing for freedom and to organize their own societies, as opposed to this like causation. And I think that's a really sharp point. That's a good way to put it, that people are forming their own communities to protect their own interests like that. So, well, great. I would encourage people to stay in touch with Fiveable and follow what's happening. As I showed the slide at the beginning, the upcoming streams would be things, for the teachers here, that would be you would present with your students, or that your students might find useful. Although in some cases, it's interesting, and I always learn things as the kind of lead teacher. I wind up listening in on a lot. I might have it on and be multitasking a little bit. I look at all the slides. I'm learning something from everyone. And I can tell you this too, that we're starting to, one of the things that I'm contributing to the project is practice questions at the end of the content streams. So tomorrow, Carolyn Castellanos is going to talk about what it means, what diasporic community means, and then give some examples. And then we wrote a short answer question so the kids can practice. She's going to have students who want type answers into a Google Doc, but they'll be kind of up in there anonymously. So they can type in answers, and then she'll highlight good answers. So it'd be real low stakes, low pressure practice for them. This is probably not the students of people who would show up to an event like this and engage here, but there's a lot of students around the country who are not doing any writing or anywhere near enough writing. I know when I was doing some of these reviews right before the AP test last year, there'd be a lot of kids, would show up. And sometime I did one on short answer questions. I'm like, how many short answer questions have you answered this year? And it's like 0 or 1 was a lot of kids. So yeah, I think, thank you. Thanks, Mike. I think it is really something, to add value. So these streams like this, these live reviews, the advantage that they have over like a YouTube video, and some of those are well done, or some aren't. But, some are. Even a well-done one is that you're going to have that interaction with a teacher, and you can see other students react, and you can see students who have different teachers, and they know different facts, and so you do things like that. So there we are. So those are the upcoming things, and you can also see those if you hit the call to action button. It'll take you there to the page. So thank you very much for coming. I hope that you all come back and we can do this again. Thank you, Allie. That's my colleague, Ms. Harry, who does a great job as well. But in a month, we'll do this again with Age of Revolutions, and there's great suggestions in the chat. So this is very much meant to be interactive, where people are bringing things. I can even bring people on camera. So now that you've done it, I can share the screen with you. So if you want to, I wore my Decolonize Your Syllabus shirt, but if you want to wear something where you wouldn't mind being on camera, you just let me know when that happens. Oh, good. Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone coming. So I'm going to say good night, and I'll see you all around.